The drums begin at dawn. Across the Valley of Mexico, the Aztec warriors gather in bright armor. Shields painted with suns, jaguars, and eagles. Their obsidian blades glint in the early light. Priests stand nearby. Faces painted in ash, chanting to the rising sun. But this isn't a war for land. It isn't for tribute, gold, or revenge. The warriors marching out today know exactly what they're fighting for: blood. This is the Exchitl, the Flower War. A ritual battle staged not to conquer, but to capture. Its purpose is as beautiful as it is horrifying: to feed the gods with human sacrifice. Why flowers? At first, the name seems almost poetic. Flower wars? Surely that sounds peaceful, symbolic, maybe even ceremonial. But in Aztec thought, flowers and war were deeply intertwined. Flowers were offerings to the gods, just like human hearts. Poets described fallen warriors as flowers cut in battle. Blood itself was called the precious water that nourished the earth. So when the Aztecs marched out for a flower war, it was war in bloom. Battles staged as ritual harvests of human life. The battlefield was a garden, and the captured were the blossoms cut for sacrifice. The war nobody was meant to win, unlike normal wars. These conflicts weren't about total destruction. They were carefully arranged between rival states. The Aztec Triple Alliance on one side, enemy cities like Tlaxcala or Huejotzingo on the other. Both sides agreed to meet in combat, knowing the outcome wouldn't shift borders. The goal wasn't conquest. It was capture. Each warrior fought not to slaughter his enemy, but to seize him alive, bind him, and drag him home to the pyramids of sacrifice. It was a war nobody wanted to win in the usual sense. A balance had to be maintained. If one side was completely crushed, the supply of sacrificial victims would dry up. And the gods, the hungry, insatiable gods, could not be left unfed. A universe fed by blood to understand why these wars existed. You have to step inside Aztec cosmology. The Aztecs believed the universe was precarious, fragile, always on the brink of collapse. The sun rose each morning only because the gods were nourished with offerings of human blood and hearts. Without sacrifice, the sun would falter, the stars would fall, the earth itself would end. The flower wars weren't barbaric in their eyes. They were maintenance, like watering a garden or stoking a fire. Except the water was blood, and the fire was the cosmos itself. For the Aztec warrior, stepping onto the battlefield was stepping into cosmic duty. To fight, and to be captured, was part of the cycle of keeping the universe alive. Warriors in bloom, the flower wars also served another purpose: training. Young Aztec men weren't considered adults until they captured enemies in battle. Captives proved bravery, skill, and devotion to the gods. The elite warrior societies, the Jaguar Knights and Eagle Knights, earned their ranks through these ritual wars. Capturing enemies elevated your status, secured honors, and ensured you would be remembered. Even being captured wasn't shameful. To die on the sacrificial altar was an honor, your heart offered to the sun, your blood flowing as cosmic payment. The battlefield was both school and stage, where men proved their worth in the eyes of gods and humans alike. The ritual of battle: picture the opening clash of a flower war. Drums thunder, conch shells wail. Warriors advance in brightly feathered costumes, jaguar pelts, eagle feathers, quetzal plumes glowing in the sunlight. Shields clash, obsidian blades flash, but the fighting is strangely restrained. Instead of killing blows, warriors aim to wound, to disable, to ensnare. They carry ropes to bind enemies. They fight with precision, grappling, wrestling, subduing. Blood is spilled. But death on the battlefield is almost accidental. The real death will come later, atop the temple steps, under the knife of the priest. And in the chaos of combat, young warriors shout prayers, calling on gods like Huitzilopochtli, the sun deity, to guide their arms. Every strike, every capture, is not just for glory, it's for the survival of the cosmos. A strange piece in war. Here's the strangest part: These wars were predictable. Arrangements were sometimes made in advance. Both sides knew what they were walking into. Imagine two states agreeing, "We'll meet on Tuesday at dawn. Fight all day, capture a few dozen of each other's men, and then go home." There were rules. There was structure. It was war as ritual, conflict as contract. Of course, it was still brutal. Men were maimed. Families lost sons. Blood soaked the fields. But it wasn't the chaos of conquest. It was organized violence in service of divine hunger. The double edge of honor for the Aztec warrior. The Flower War carried both glory and doom. To capture many enemies was to rise in prestige. To be captured yourself was to face the knife, but also immortality. Captured warriors didn't see themselves as victims. Many embraced their fate. Some went proudly to the altar, knowing their sacrifice was vital. Death in battle or death on the temple steps were both paths to the afterlife reserved for warriors. A paradise where you accompanied the sun across the sky. In that sense, Flower Wars weren't just battles. They were ceremonies in motion, rituals of honor, sacrifice, and cosmic balance. Setting the stage for what's next so as the drums echo across the valley and the warriors march to meet their rivals. Understand this, they weren't fighting for land or gold. They weren't fighting to annihilate their enemies. They were fighting to harvest human lives. To pluck flowers from the battlefield and lay them at the feet of their gods. It was a system at once horrifying and logical, a war that wasn't war at all, but a performance staged on the grandest scale, with the universe itself as the audience. In the next section, we'll dig deeper into why these wars mattered so much, the theology of blood, the politics of empire, and the way Flower Wars kept Aztec society in constant motion. Because in the Aztec world, war wasn't just about power. It was about keeping the sun alive. If you've ever wondered why anyone would willingly march into a war they weren't supposed to win, the answer lies in Aztec belief. To them, the Flower Wars weren't madness. They were survival. The Aztecs lived in a universe constantly teetering on the edge of collapse. To keep the cosmos alive, the gods demanded payment. And the currency was blood. A fragile sun in Aztec mythology. We live under the fifth sun. 4 worlds had existed before, each destroyed in catastrophe. Giants devoured in darkness. Floods washing away humanity. Fires consuming the earth. Every sun had died. The fifth sun, the Aztecs believed, was no different. It too would end, unless the gods were kept strong with nourishment. And that nourishment wasn't prayers, wasn't incense, wasn't gold. It was living hearts, still warm, cut from the chests of captives and lifted to the sky. Without sacrifice, the sun would falter in its journey across the heavens. The crops would fail, the world would sink into darkness. Every ritual, every war, every breath was tied to this cosmic contract: feed the gods, or the world ends. So when warriors marched into Flower Wars, they weren't just fighting for glory. They were fighting to keep the sun burning. The debt of blood. The Aztecs believed humanity owed the gods a debt. According to myth, the gods had sacrificed themselves to create the world. Quetzalcoatl bled to give life to humans. Nanahuatzin, the humble god, leapt into a fire to become the sun. If the gods had given their blood for creation, then humans owed blood in return. It was reciprocity, a cosmic economy. The Aztecs didn't see sacrifice as cruelty. They saw it as payment. A debt humans could never fully repay, but could never stop trying to. The Flower Wars were the installment plan. A steady stream of lives to keep the account balanced. Politics in bloom, of course. Religion wasn't the only motive. Flower Wars were political, too. The Aztec Empire, or Triple Alliance, ruled a vast network of city-states. Tribute flowed in from conquered lands: maize, feathers, cacao, obsidian, and more. But not every neighbor bowed easily. Some resisted, most famously the Tlaxcalans. Rather than annihilate them, the Aztecs fought them in Flower Wars. Why? Because keeping a rival alive was useful. As long as Tlaxcala existed, It provided a renewable supply of captives. Total conquest would cut off that stream. So the wars became a balancing act, enough blood to feed the gods. Enough enemies left standing to fight again next year. It was politics as much as piety. Training the warriors' flower wars also served as military academies. Young Aztec men were expected to prove themselves in battle. Capturing an enemy was the ultimate test of bravery and skill. A boy could not fully come of age until he had taken captives. Advancement into the elite warrior orders, Jaguar Knights and Eagle Knights, depended on it. Even marriage prospects improved with each successful capture. So when the drums called for a flower war, it wasn't just about the gods. It was about the careers of thousands of young men. It was the proving ground of an entire society. War as ritual performance. The name Flower War reveals another layer. These battles weren't seen as slaughter, but as ritual performances. Aztec poetry is filled with metaphors linking flowers, song, and blood. To die in battle was to become a flower of the field. To offer your heart was to bloom eternally in the garden of the gods. This wasn't just propaganda. It was deeply ingrained philosophy. Warriors were raised from childhood to see combat as sacred art. Not just violence. They marched into battle not with dread, but with the conviction that they were gardeners of the cosmos, harvesting blossoms for the altar. Feeding the machine at its core, the flower war was fuel for a relentless machine. The temples of Tenochtitlan demanded a constant supply of bodies. Festivals, rituals, seasonal sacrifices, all required captives. Without the flower wars, the empire's religious engine would grind to a halt. Tribute kept the empire fed. Captives kept the gods fed. Both were necessary. And so the wars continued, year after year. Staged carnage feeding an insatiable hunger. The morality of sacrifice. From our perspective, it seems grotesque. How could anyone accept this system? But for the Aztecs, morality was inverted. Killing in battle wasn't murder. It was duty. Dying as a captive wasn't tragedy, it was honor. Aztec parents taught their children that a warrior's highest calling was to bleed for the gods. Captives weren't despised. They were revered as offerings. In a strange way, both sides in a flower war walked willingly into the jaws of ritual, knowing their blood kept the universe alive. Rivals who understood the rules, even Aztec enemies, played along. Tlaxcala, Huayotzingo, and other city-states fought these wars with equal conviction. They, too, believed in the gods' hunger for them. Participating in flower wars wasn't just about resisting Aztec domination, it was about fulfilling religious duty. In this way, the wars became a shared ritual of enemies. Both sides hated each other, but both agreed. The gods must be fed. The strange logic. So when you picture a flower war, don't imagine senseless carnage. Imagine an agreement between rivals. We will meet on the battlefield, fight with all our might, capture each other's men, and offer them to the gods. It was war as contract. War as cosmic theater. War as an economy of blood. To outsiders, it looks bizarre. To the Aztecs, it was the only way to keep the universe turning. Closing of section 2. So why did the Aztecs fight flower wars? Because the sun demanded it. Because the gods had given their blood, and humanity had to return the debt. Because politics required it. Society expected it, and young men's honor depended on it. In the next section, we'll step onto the battlefield itself. We'll watch how warriors fought, how they trained to capture instead of kill, and how the ritual of combat unfolded with ropes, blades, and obsidian. Because in a flower war, the fight wasn't about death on the field. It was about capturing life and carrying it home to die on the altar. The drums thunder. Conch shells echo. Warriors pour onto the field. Feathers flashing in the sun, obsidian blades gleaming black and sharp as razors. This is the flower war battlefield. But unlike Europe's muddy fields of pikes and gunpowder, this isn't a slaughterhouse. It's a stage. And every warrior here knows his role. The cast of warriors, the Aztec army, was a spectacle in itself. Ordinary men fought, But the stars were the elite orders, jaguar warriors, clad in jaguar skins. Fierce and painted with spots, roaring as they leapt into combat. Eagle warriors, covered in feathers, helmets shaped like beaks, embodying the sun itself. Common warriors, brightly dressed, armed with obsidian-edged macuahuitl. Wooden clubs lined with blades sharp enough to decapitate a horse. Each man's goal was the same, not to kill, but to capture. Tools of capture. Capturing a man alive required skill. Along with their blades, warriors carried ropes and lassos to ensnare enemies. They used shields not just for defense, but to pin opponents. Some even wielded hooked staffs for yanking foes to the ground. The macuahuitl could kill, but more often it was used to disable, smashing at legs or arms to bring the enemy down without finishing him off. It was a brutal dance: slash, stun, grapple, bind. Training for the hunt from childhood, Aztec boys trained for this moment. In the Telpoch-Cali schools, they learned to march, chant, and wield weapons. In the Karmikak, the schools for nobles, training was even harsher. Days of fasting, sleepless nights, relentless drills. Teachers struck boys with obsidian shards to toughen them. They carried loads of firewood to build endurance. They learned how to lasso, wrestle, and subdue. Because one successful capture meant everything: advancement in society, proof of manhood, even the right to marry. The flower war was the exam, and the battlefield the classroom. The clash when the armies met. It wasn't a mindless charge. It was organized chaos. War cries pierced the air. Eagle and jaguar knights sought each other out, aiming to capture warriors of equal prestige. Young fighters tested their courage against seasoned veterans. Blades smashed against shields, ropes whipped through the air. Warriors grappled in the dust. Instead of stabbing for the heart, they lunged for the arms, pinned shoulders, hooked legs. Capturing a foe alive was harder, and more honorable, than killing. Imagine rugby, but with obsidian clubs and blood. The strange mercy death wasn't the immediate goal. That's what makes these wars so bizarre. A warrior could slash an enemy's arm open, knock him down, but stop short of the killing blow. Instead, he bound him, dragging him back through the dust, holding him aloft like a trophy. The battlefield became a strange parade, warriors hauling prisoners by the hair, captives screaming, struggling, sometimes resigned. Blood flowed, but the final death would come later, on the temple steps. The honor of capture in Aztec society, the true mark of valor, was not how many enemies you killed, but how many you captured. A warrior with 4 captives earned the right to join the prestigious warrior orders. More captives meant better clothing, higher rank, even the chance to dine with the emperor. Parents boasted of sons who returned with prisoners. Captives were displayed proudly before being led to the temples. It was war as harvest, and each captive was a flower plucked for the gods. For the captured. And what about the captives themselves? Strangely, being captured wasn't always seen as humiliation. In their worldview, to be chosen as a sacrifice was to become sacred. Some captives accepted their fate with dignity, even pride, knowing their hearts would nourish the gods. But let's not romanticize too much. Many captives resisted, begged, or tried to flee. To die on the altar was glorious in theory, but terrifying in practice. Accounts describe captives crying out as they were dragged through the streets, bound in ropes, on their way to the pyramids. It was honor and horror intertwined. Ritual in motion. Every detail of the flower war was ritualized. The banners, the costumes, the music, even the choreography of battle, all were offerings. The field itself was sacred ground. Warriors shouted prayers as they fought, calling on gods like Huitzilopochtli, the sun god, and Tezcatlipoca, the god of fate and conflict. Each capture was a prayer answered. Each bound captive, a promise kept to the gods. A different logic from the outside, the flower wars look absurd. A battle where killing is discouraged? Where both sides walk in expecting to lose men to sacrifice? But within the Aztec worldview, the logic was clear. War was not about annihilation. It was about balance. Each side gave and took, ensuring the gods remained fed and the cosmos kept alive. It was less like modern war, and more like a deadly ritual game, played with real lives. Bound by rules as rigid as any sport. The aftermath of battle when the fighting ended. Each side gathered their captives. Some battles ended with dozens taken, others with hundreds. Warriors marched home carrying their living prizes. Families mourned their lost sons. But with a strange mix of grief and pride. The captives would soon be honored in sacrifice. Their blood poured out to keep the sun rising. And the warriors who returned with captives? They basked in glory. Their names remembered, their honor secured. Closing of Section 3. So the Flower War battlefield was less a killing ground and more a hunting field. A place where men clashed not to destroy, but to harvest life for the gods. It was violent. Yes. Brutal. Yes. But it was also ritualized, sacred, and, in its own way, logical to the Aztec mind. In the next section, we'll follow the captives home, to the temples of Tenochtitlan, where drums thundered. Priests raised knives of obsidian, and the Flower War found its ultimate purpose. Because the battlefield was only the beginning. The altar was the end. The Flower War didn't end on the battlefield. In fact, the battlefield was just the first act. The true climax came days later, in the heart of Tenochtitlan. Under the shadow of the great Templo Mayor. This was where captives completed their journey. From warriors on the field to offerings on the altar. The procession, the captives were paraded through the streets. Ropes bound their arms, feathers and banners marked their ranks. Crowds gathered to watch. Cheering or mourning depending on who had been taken. Children gawked. Women tossed flowers. Priests chanted hymns. Their faces painted black and red. The city itself became a stage, and the captives. Unwilling actors in a cosmic play. For the Aztecs, this wasn't cruelty. It was duty. Every step toward the temple was a step toward saving the world. The temple steps at the top of the pyramid, the priests waited. Dressed in jaguar skins, eagle feathers, or blackened cloaks, they wielded obsidian knives sharp enough to split bone. Their bodies were spattered with blood. The stains of previous ceremonies layered upon them like armor. The captives were led up the steep steps. One by one. The climb itself was part of the ritual. To ascend was to approach the gods. To leave the world of men behind. Imagine it, the drums pounding, the chants rising. The air thick with incense and sweat. At the summit, the sun blazed overhead. And the captives knelt before the altar. The moment of sacrifice, then came the knife. For priests held the captive down, pinning arms and legs against the stone. The high priest raised his obsidian blade, muttered invocations, and drove it into the chest. In one swift motion, the heart was cut free. Still beating, and lifted to the sun. Blood poured down the altar, staining the steps red. The body was rolled down the pyramid to the crowd below, where it landed with a thud. This was the climax of the Flower War. The gods had been fed. The sun had been strengthened. The world would go on. Death as performance to us, it sounds grotesque. But to the Aztecs, it was sacred theater. Each sacrifice was not death but transformation. The captive became divine. Their heart a flower offered to the sun, their blood the precious water that nourished the earth. The audience didn't recoil. They celebrated. The sacrifice wasn't tragedy, it was triumph. The gods had been honored. The debt of blood repaid, the cycle renewed. Variations on the theme, the knife and heart sacrifice was the most famous. But not the only ritual. Some captives were shot with arrows until their bodies bristled like hedgehogs. Blood dripping as an offering to agricultural gods. Others were burned, their ashes scattered as sacred fertilizer. In gladiatorial sacrifices, a captive was tied to a platform and forced to fight elite Aztec warriors. Armed only with a feathered stick while his opponents carried obsidian clubs. Needless to say, it didn't end well for the captive. Each method carried symbolic meaning, tied to myths and gods. Each was a flower in the ritual bouquet. The cosmic contract renewed at the heart of it all was reciprocity. The gods had given their lives to create the world. Humans returned the gift. Without these offerings, the sun might falter, crops might fail, the stars themselves might abandon the sky. Every sacrifice was a renewal of the cosmic contract. Every heart torn out was a reminder that life itself was borrowed, and the rent was paid in blood. Honor in death, and strangely, for many captives, this was not shame but honor. Dying as a sacrifice elevated them beyond ordinary mortals. They became companions of the gods, warriors of the sun, destined to follow the dawn across the heavens. Accounts describe some captives accepting their fate proudly, even joyfully. They knew their names would live on, their deaths woven into the great story of the universe. It was a worldview where death wasn't the end, but the fulfillment of purpose. The horror and the beauty to outsiders, including the Spanish, who would later seize on these rituals as evidence of savagery. The sacrifices looked monstrous. But within Aztec culture, they were beautiful. Songs and poems celebrated the offerings. Warriors spoke of flowering death. Priests saw themselves as gardeners, tending the divine with blossoms of human life. It was horror wrapped in beauty, brutality cloaked in poetry. The city as theater on major feast days, sacrifices could number in the hundreds, even thousands. The entire city pulsed with ritual, markets closed, families gathered, music filled the air. It was communal spectacle. Everyone participated, everyone watched. The flower wars fed this cycle. They ensured the temples never ran dry of offerings. That every festival had its captives, that every drumbeat had its echo in blood. Closing of section 4. So this was the final act of the flower wars, the captives laid on stone. The knives flashing, the hearts lifted to the sun. It was not just death, it was theater, theology, politics, and survival all at once. In the next section, we'll step back and ask, what legacy did the flower wars leave? How did the Spanish react when they stumbled upon this system of ritualized battle and sacrifice? And how do we, centuries later, make sense of a culture where war was staged as gardening for the gods? Because the flower wars didn't just end with the fall of the Aztecs. Their strange logic still blooms in history's imagination. The flower wars ended centuries ago, but their echoes linger. They remain one of the most bizarre traditions in human history. Wars fought not for land, not for gold, but to harvest life for the gods. So what legacy did these ritual battles leave behind? How did the world remember them? And what can we learn from a society where blood itself was currency? The Spanish encounter when Hernán Cortés and his conquistadors marched into central Mexico in the early 1500s. They were stunned by what they found. Not just the temples, not just the gold, but the ritual of sacrifice on a scale Europe had never seen. For the Spanish, the flower wars were propaganda gold. Here was proof, they claimed, that the Aztecs were savages in need of Christian salvation. Priests wrote horrified accounts of captives led up temple steps, hearts ripped out, blood flowing like rivers. Of course, the Spanish exaggerated. They inflated numbers, painting pictures of tens of thousands sacrificed at once. The reality was brutal enough. But colonial propaganda turned it into horror theater, justifying conquest in the name of God. The flower wars became the perfect excuse. Spain could say, see? They cut out hearts for their gods. We must save them. And with that, they toppled an empire. Tlaxcala's revenge ironically. The very enemies the Aztecs had fought in flower wars, the Tlaxcalans, became Spain's allies. For generations, they had shed blood in ritual combat with the Aztecs. Now, they saw their chance for revenge. When Cortés marched on Tenochtitlan, Tlaxcalan warriors marched beside him. The flower wars had weakened them, but they had also forged them into fierce fighters. In the end, the ritual battles that once fed the gods helped Spain feed its empire. The archaeological loss centuries later. Archaeologists look back at the flower wars with mixed emotions. On one hand, they offer a glimpse into Aztec cosmology, a worldview where war and sacrifice were sacred duties. On the other, the wars meant countless lives lost, countless traditions destroyed. Unlike Egyptian pyramids or Roman arenas, the Flower Wars left little physical trace. Their legacy is written mostly in Spanish chronicles, Aztec poetry, and the bloodstains of memory. The poetry of death, but not all memories are horror. Aztec songs and poems speak of the Flower Wars in language both beautiful and chilling. Warriors as flowers of the battlefield. Blood as precious water. Death as a blossoming, a gift to the sun. It's hard for us to reconcile the brutality wrapped in such lyrical imagery. But that was the Aztec worldview, beauty and violence intertwined, honor and death inseparable. Legacy in imagination even today. The Flower Wars fascinate. Historians debate whether they were primarily religious, political, or military. Some see them as sacred sport, closer to ritualized games than true war. Others see them as calculated state terror, keeping enemies in check through fear. In popular imagination, they've become symbols of Aztec otherness. Movies, books, and documentaries lean into the drama of warriors fighting to feed the gods. The image is unforgettable. Young men marching willingly to capture and be captured, knowing their lives might end on an altar. The moral question: so what do we make of it? Were the Aztecs monsters, spilling blood for a cruel pantheon? Or were they pragmatists, living out a cosmic contract they believed kept the sun alive? The answer lies somewhere in between. To them, the Flower Wars made sense. Within their worldview, sacrifice wasn't horror, it was hope. They weren't trying to destroy the world. They were trying to save it. And that's the unsettling part. Every culture believes its own logic. To the Aztecs, our wars for oil or ideology might look just as strange. The ultimate irony in the end, the Flower Wars couldn't save the Aztecs. Their gods demanded blood. But blood could not stop Spanish steel, guns, and disease. The sun they fought to keep alive continued to rise, but their empire fell. And yet, the idea of the Flower Wars survives. They've become legend, a reminder of humanity's capacity for both devotion and destruction. Final reflection: the Flower Wars were wars without conquest, battles without victory, deaths without defeat. They were gardening with blades, harvesting humans like blossoms to be laid at the feet of hungry gods. To us, they seem bizarre, even monstrous. To the Aztecs, they were necessary. The sun would rise tomorrow only if hearts beat their last today. That is the legacy of the Flower Wars. A reminder that history is full of worlds built on logics alien to our own, and that some